The morning light filtered through the dust-covered windows of Deborah Miller's bedroom, a room that had been hers for the past 23 years since she and her late husband Richard had purchased the two-story colonial in Fairfield, Connecticut. The May sunshine cast long shadows across the hardwood floor, illuminating the framed family photos that lined her dresser. Deborah sat on the edge of her bed, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, staring at the cardboard boxes her son Michael had dropped off the previous evening. At 67, she had expected her retirement years to be peaceful, perhaps traveling occasionally, tending to her garden, and enjoying weekly book club meetings with friends she'd known for decades. Instead, she found herself facing an unexpected upheaval. "Mom," Michael had said yesterday, standing in her doorway with his arms crossed. He didn't sit down, didn't ask how she was feeling. At 39, her only son had grown increasingly distant since moving back into the family home 3 months ago, following his divorce from Allison. "We need to make some changes around here." Deborah had looked up from her novel, removing her reading glasses. "What kind of changes, dear?" "I need this room for storage. My business is expanding, and I need somewhere to keep inventory." He gestured vaguely at her surroundings. The hand-quilted bedspread Richard's mother had made, the watercolor paintings from her community art class, the small writing desk where she penned letters to her sister in Arizona. "Your business?" Deborah asked carefully. Michael's business ventures had a history of starting with grand ambitions and ending with financial requests. His latest endeavor involved dropshipping electronics, something he insisted would make him financially independent within 6 months. "Yes, Mom, my business. I've told you about it." His tone carried the same impatience he'd had as a teenager. "Anyway, I've cleared out some space in the garage. There's that old futon out there, and I brought down a small dresser. It'll be fine." The garage, where the temperature fluctuated wildly with the seasons, where the concrete floor would send pain through her arthritic knees, where Richard's tools still hung on pegboards, untouched since his passing 3 years ago. "Michael, I don't think—" "Mom, this is temporary, just until I get things going. You're always saying you want to help me get back on my feet after the divorce." He didn't meet her eyes. "Besides, it's my house too. Dad would have wanted me to be successful." Now, in the morning light, Deborah's fingers trembled slightly as she folded a cardigan and placed it in one of the boxes. She hadn't argued further yesterday, hadn't mentioned that Richard had left the house to her entirely in his will, that Michael had moved back in as a favor to him during a difficult time, or that her late husband would have been appalled at their son's behavior. Instead, she had nodded silently, watching as Michael looked around the room, already measuring it with his eyes for shelving units. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway announced Michael's approach. He appeared in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, dressed in sweatpants despite it being nearly 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. "How's the packing coming along?" he asked, his tone suggesting this was a casual inquiry about weekend plans, rather than forcing his mother into a garage. "It's coming along," Deborah replied quietly, placing a framed photo of Richard into the box, carefully wrapping it in a sweater. "Great. I've got some guys coming Friday to help set up the shelving, so if you could be all moved out by Thursday night, that would be perfect." He took a sip of coffee. "Oh, and Mom, the Wi-Fi doesn't reach the garage very well, so you might want to get one of those book lights if you want to read out there." Deborah nodded again, not trusting herself to speak. Michael lingered for a moment, perhaps waiting for reassurance that his request wasn't unreasonable, before shrugging and walking away. She heard him on the phone moments later, his voice animated as he discussed profit margins with someone. When she was certain he wouldn't return, Deborah reached for her cell phone on the nightstand. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for: Patricia Winters. Pat had been her realtor when they bought this house, had become a friend over the years, and had recently helped sell the Johnsons' place down the street. Deborah's finger hovered over the call button. 3 years of widowhood had taught her self-reliance. Decades of motherhood had taught her patience, but some lessons came later in life, like recognizing when respect had been irrevocably broken. She pressed call, and Pat answered on the third ring. "Pat? It's Deborah Miller." She took a deep breath, her voice steadying. "I'd like to discuss listing my house for sale as soon as possible." As she spoke, Deborah gazed out the window at the cherry tree in full bloom in the front yard, the tree Richard had planted when Michael was born. Sometimes, she reflected, the most difficult decisions were also the quietest ones. The following morning, Deborah woke before sunrise, her back stiff from the thin mattress on the fold-out futon in the garage. She had spent the previous night there, not waiting for Thursday as Michael had suggested. Better to adjust now, she thought, than to prolong the inevitable. The concrete floor radiated cold through her slippers as she made her way to the small space heater she'd positioned near the makeshift bed. Through the single window, high on the garage wall, she could see the sky transitioning from deep navy to the soft lavender of dawn. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of her situation, displaced from her bedroom, relegated to this afterthought of a living space by her own son. The dampness in the air made her arthritis flare, a sharp reminder of her age and vulnerability. But Deborah Miller had never been one to wallow. Richard used to tease her about her steel magnolia quality, soft-spoken and unfailingly polite, yet possessed of an inner strength that, when tested, surprised even those who thought they knew her best. At 7:30 a.m., when she was certain Michael would still be asleep, Deborah quietly entered the house through the kitchen door. She started the coffee maker and prepared a simple breakfast of toast and fruit. Then she retreated to the garage with her meal, careful not to disturb her son's slumber. She had an appointment with Pat at 9 a.m., and she didn't want Michael asking questions about where she was going. By 8:45, Deborah had dressed in a navy pantsuit that she reserved for special occasions, applied a touch of lipstick, and was backing her silver Camry out of the driveway. Michael's bedroom blinds remained closed as she pulled away from the home she had lovingly maintained for over 2 decades. Patricia Winter's real estate office occupied a converted Victorian house on Fairfield's Main Street. The bell chimed softly as Deborah entered, and Pat, a stylish woman in her early 60s with a sleek grey bob, emerged from her office with arms outstretched. "Deborah, it's been too long." Pat embraced her, then stepped back, studying her friend's face. "When you called yesterday, I was surprised. You've always said you'd never sell that house." Deborah settled into a chair across from Pat's desk, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Things change, Pat. Circumstances change." Over the next hour, Deborah explained her situation, Michael's return after his divorce, his increasingly entitled behavior, and finally, the demand that she relocate to the garage so he could use her bedroom for storage. Pat's expression darkened as Deborah spoke. "And the house is solely in your name after Richard passed?" "Yes, he left it to me outright in his will." "Then, forgive my bluntness, but why not just tell Michael to find his own place?" Deborah gazed out the window at the maple trees lining the street. "Because if I confronted him directly, it would mean a fight, harsh words that can't be taken back. I've watched enough families fracture that way." She turned back to Pat. "I'd rather just remove myself from the equation, let the consequences speak for themselves." Pat nodded slowly. "So you want to sell without telling him first?" "Yes, Connecticut is a single-party consent state for property sales, when the title holder is the only one making the decision." Deborah had researched this carefully. "I want to list it immediately, accept the first reasonable offer, and close as quickly as possible." Pat tapped her pen against her notepad. "The market in Fairfield is hot right now. With your location and the condition of your home, we could list by tomorrow and potentially have offers by the weekend." She hesitated. "But Deborah, where will you go?" A small smile crossed Deborah's face. "My sister Jean has been begging me to move closer to her in Sedona for years. She has a guest house on her property that's been sitting empty. I called her last night." "And Michael?" "Michael will learn that actions have consequences." There was no vindictiveness in Deborah's voice, only a calm certainty. "The utility bills are still in his name from when he lived there before his marriage. He insisted on keeping it that way for his credit history. By noon, Deborah had signed the listing agreement. Pat promised to have a photographer at the house the following day, while Michael would be at his part-time job at the electronics store, the only steady income he had despite his grand business plans. "We'll list at $625,000, Pat said. "Given the market and your location, I wouldn't be surprised if we got offers above asking." As Deborah drove home, she made 2 more stops. First, at the bank, where she opened a new account at a different institution from the one she and Michael used. Then at her regular bank, where she transferred most of her savings to the new account, leaving only enough in the joint account to cover immediate expenses. When she arrived home, Michael's car was gone, likely off to meet friends for lunch, using money from the business loan Deborah had given him 2 months ago. She took the opportunity to gather important documents from the Home Office. Her birth certificate, Richard's death certificate, insurance policies, and the deed to the house. That evening, as Deborah sat in the garage with a novel illuminated by the booklight Michael had so thoughtfully mentioned she would need, her son poked his head through the door. "Hey, Mom, I ordered pizza if you want some." "Thank you, dear. I'll be in shortly." Her voice betrayed nothing of her plans. Michael lingered in the doorway. "You know, once the business takes off, maybe we can convert the attic into a nice apartment for you. Much better than this." He gestured vaguely at the space he had relegated her to. "That would be lovely," Deborah replied, her expression serene. Later, as she lay on the futon listening to the occasional creaks of the house settling, Deborah felt an unexpected sense of peace. For 3 years since Richard's death, she had been drifting, her purpose unclear. Now, ironically, thanks to Michael's thoughtlessness, she had direction again. The next day passed in a carefully orchestrated dance. While Michael was at work, Pat and the photographer came to the house. Deborah had spent the morning making sure everything was immaculate, the kitchen counters gleaming, fresh flowers in the living room, beds perfectly made. Even Michael's room, which he had left in typical disarray, was tidied for the photos. "It looks wonderful," Pat said, as the photographer captured the last shots of the backyard garden. "The listing will go live tomorrow morning." Deborah nodded, a mixture of emotions washing over her. This house held so many memories. Michael's height marks on the kitchen doorframe, holidays around the dining room table, Richard's last Christmas before his heart gave out. But a house was just a structure. The memories would travel with her. That evening, as Deborah prepared a simple dinner in the kitchen, Michael burst through the front door, his face animated. "Mom, great news! I just landed a huge supplier contract. This business is about to blow up." He dropped his keys on the counter. "I'm thinking of getting a new car to celebrate. Maybe that BMW I've had my eye on." "That's wonderful, Michael," Deborah said, stirring the soup on the stove. "But perhaps waiting until you have actual profits might be more prudent." Michael waved dismissively. "You sound just like Dad, always so cautious. Sometimes you have to project success to achieve it." Deborah merely smiled and served the soup. As they ate, Michael talked endlessly about his plans, never once asking about her day or how she was adjusting to the garage. It struck her that he hadn't even questioned why she had moved out immediately, rather than waiting until Thursday. By Friday morning, just as Michael's friends arrived with a rental truck full of shelving units for her former bedroom, Deborah's phone buzzed with a text from Pat. 3 offers already. 1 all cash, $640K, 15-day close. Call me." Deborah stepped outside to make the call, watching as the men carried metal shelving past her. One of them nodded politely. Michael didn't introduce her. "I'll take the cash offer," Deborah told Pat, her voice low but firm. "Let's proceed immediately." 2 weeks, she thought as she ended the call. 2 weeks until this chapter of her life closed, and a new one where she was valued and respected, would begin. The next 7 days passed with a peculiar duality for Deborah. On the surface, life continued as if nothing had changed. She prepared simple meals in the kitchen, tended to her small garden in the backyard, and exchanged pleasantries with Michael when their paths crossed. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, a whirlwind of activity progressed. The home inspection completed and passed, paperwork processed through her lawyer's office, and daily updates from Pat about the closing timeline. "We're on track for next Friday," Pat confirmed during a hushed phone call Deborah took in the garden, well away from the house. The buyers are eager. They're relocating for work and love that the house is in move-in condition. The irony wasn't lost on Deborah. For years, she had maintained the house meticulously, often with little appreciation from Michael. Now that same care was facilitating her swift departure. On Tuesday morning, a week after accepting the offer, Deborah sat at the small folding table she'd set up in the garage, making lists and checking them twice. Most of her clothing and personal items remained in boxes. She had told Michael she was organizing rather than unpacking, a half-truth he hadn't questioned. Today's task involved discreetly sorting what would go to Arizona and what would be donated or sold. The sound of the kitchen door opening and closing caught her attention. Michael should have been at his part-time job until at least noon. Deborah quickly slipped the real estate paperwork under a magazine just as the garage door swung open. "Mom, you in here?" Michael appeared, dressed not in his work uniform but in jeans and a polo shirt. His hair was freshly cut, and he carried a take-out coffee cup from the expensive cafe downtown. "I thought you were working today," Deborah said, keeping her voice neutral. "Called in sick." He shrugged, taking a sip of coffee. "Had a meeting with a potential investor for the business. Looks promising." He glanced around the garage, seeming to truly notice her living conditions for the first time. The space heater humming in the corner, the plastic storage bins serving as makeshift side tables, the extension cord running from the single outlet to power her lamp, phone charger, and small fan. Something like discomfort flickered across his face before he masked it. "Listen, Mom, I was thinking, maybe the garage isn't the best setup after all." For a moment, hope fluttered in Deborah's chest. Was he having a change of heart? Having you go through the kitchen every time you need to use the bathroom isn't ideal," he continued. "Plus, I realized I could actually use this space too, for larger inventory items." The flutter of hope collapsed. "I see," Deborah said quietly. "What did you have in mind instead?" Michael leaned against the wall, looking pleased with himself. "So I was checking out the basement. If we cleared out those old holiday decorations and Dad's workbench, there'd be plenty of room for a bed, and maybe even one of those portable toilet things. You know, like they have for camping." Deborah stared at her son, momentarily speechless. The basement, with its low ceiling that even she, at 5'4", had to duck to avoid the pipes, where water seeped in during heavy rains, where they had once found a family of raccoons nesting in winter. "A portable toilet," she repeated, her voice faint. "Yeah, it's super convenient. No more trips upstairs in the middle of the night." He gestured enthusiastically. "And I figured we could put in one of those dehumidifiers to help with the dampness." Deborah looked at her son, really looked at him. When had he become this person? This man who could suggest his mother use a camping toilet in a damp basement and present it as a thoughtful solution? Had Richard and she failed so completely in raising him? Or had his divorce from Allison, a kind woman who had tried to temper Michael's self-centeredness, removed the last check on his behavior? "I'll think about it," Deborah said finally, knowing she needed to maintain the facade for just a few more days. "Great. No rush. Maybe this weekend we can start moving things down there." He glanced at his watch. "I gotta run. Meeting a buddy for lunch to talk about expanding the business territory." After he left, Deborah sat motionless, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The basement, a portable toilet. Each new indignity strengthened her resolve. She picked up her phone and dialed Jean. "How's Operation Dignity going?" her sister asked immediately. "Accelerating," Deborah replied. "I need to move up my flight. Is next Saturday too soon?" "Honey, I'd come get you tomorrow if you needed it. Saturday's perfect. The guest house is all ready. I put in those curtains you liked when you visited last fall." Tears pricked at Deborah's eyes. "Thank you, Jean. I can't wait to see you." Is he still being a complete jackass? "Language, Jean," Deborah chided automatically, then sighed. "He wants to move me to the basement now. with a camping toilet. The silence on the other end spoke volumes before Jean finally said, "I'll pick you up at the airport myself. Just tell me what flight." That afternoon, while Michael was still out, Deborah drove to the local UPS store. There, she arranged to ship 6 boxes of her most precious belongings to Jean's address in Sedona. Family photos, Richard's watch collection that he'd wanted Michael to have one day when he showed some maturity, handwritten recipe cards from her grandmother, and the quilts Richard's mother had made for each major occasion in their lives. The rest would go into a car for the drive to the airport or be left behind. "Doing some spring cleaning?" asked the friendly clerk as he labeled the boxes. "Something like that," Deborah replied with a small smile. A fresh start. By the time Michael returned home that evening, smelling faintly of beer and speaking too loudly about his productive business meetings, Deborah had composed herself. She served the lasagna she'd prepared, one of Michael's favorites, and listened to him expound on his plans for transforming the basement into what he kept referring to as her private apartment. "And the best part," he said, gesturing with his fork, "is that once you're downstairs, I can use the garage for my car again. Win-win." "Indeed," Deborah murmured. "More wine, dear." On Thursday, 2 days before the scheduled closing, Deborah received a text from Pat. "Papers ready at attorney's office. Can you sign tomorrow at 10 a.m.? The timing was perfect. Michael had mentioned he'd be at his part-time job from 8 a.m. until 4 p.m. tomorrow, one of the few full shifts he still bothered to work. She confirmed the appointment and went to bed early, listening to the sounds of Michael playing video games upstairs well past midnight. Friday morning dawned bright and clear, a beautiful May day that seemed to affirm Deborah's decision. She dressed carefully in a pale blue suit, another appointment with her investment advisor, as far as Michael knew, and left the house while he was still asleep, having called in sick to work again. At the attorney's office, surrounded by the comforting scent of leather-bound books and furniture polish, Deborah signed page after page, transferring ownership of the house she had loved for 23 years to a young family relocating from Boston. "The funds will be wired to your new account by end of business today," the attorney, a contemporary of Richard's, assured her. "Pat tells me you're moving to Arizona." "Yes, to be near my sister," Deborah confirmed, signing the final document with a steady hand. "Richard would have approved," he said kindly. "He always said you deserved nothing but happiness." Tears threatened again, but Deborah blinked them away. "Thank you, Howard. That means a great deal." By the time she returned home, the house was empty. Michael's car was gone, and a hastily scrawled note on the kitchen counter informed her he'd gone to check out retail space for the business and would be back for dinner. Perfect. This gave Deborah the afternoon to implement the final phase of her plan. First, she called the utility companies, electric, gas, water, internet, and informed them she was no longer the homeowner as of today, and to please direct all future bills to Michael Miller, whose name was already on the accounts. She arranged for her mail to be forwarded to Jean's address in Sedona, effective immediately. Next, she made a careful sweep of the house, ensuring she hadn't forgotten anything of importance. In the home office, she paused at the filing cabinet where she and Richard had kept family documents. Inside the folder marked "Michael, Important," she placed an envelope containing a brief letter she had written the night before, along with a copy of the house sale documents. The letter read, "Michael, by the time you read this, the house will have been legally sold to its new owners, who will be taking possession tomorrow. As the sole owner of the property following your father's passing, this was my decision to make alone. I have left $3,000 in the joint checking account to help you secure new housing. This is the last financial assistance I will provide. The utilities remain in your name, and I have notified the companies of my departure. Perhaps you're wondering why I didn't simply ask you to leave. The truth is, I wanted you to understand, truly understand, what it feels like to have your security and dignity stripped away without warning or discussion. I raised you to be better than the man you've become. Your father would be deeply disappointed, as am I. When you moved me to the garage and then suggested the basement with a camping toilet, you revealed how little respect you have for me, not just as your mother, but as a human being deserving of basic dignity. I will be staying with Aunt Jean in Sedona. Please do not attempt to contact me until you have taken time to reflect on your actions and are prepared to offer a genuine apology. I will know when that time comes, if it ever does. Despite everything, I love you, but love without respect is hollow, and I respect myself too much to accept how you've treated me. Mum Deborah sealed the envelope and placed it prominently on top of the filing cabinet, where Michael would eventually find it when the reality of the situation dawned on him. Her final task was both the most difficult and the most liberating. She packed her suitcase with the last of her clothing, loaded it and a few remaining boxes into her Camry, and took one last walk through the home that had witnessed so much of her life. In the living room, she touched the mantel where family photos had stood for decades. In the kitchen, she ran her hand along the countertop where she had prepared countless meals. Upstairs, she paused at the doorway of her former bedroom, now filled with metal shelving units stacked with electronics in various stages of unboxing. Nowhere in this transformation had Michael kept any space for her belongings, her memories, her presence. It was as if he had been erasing her gradually, making room for his life at the expense of hers. In Michael's room, Deborah placed a small, wrapped package on his unmade bed, a framed photo of him as a child with Richard, both of them smiling on a fishing trip. Despite everything, she couldn't bear to take this memory from him. Downstairs again, Deborah stood in the center of the kitchen, absorbing the familiar sounds and scents one last time. Then, with a deep breath, she removed her house key from her keychain and placed it on the counter next to Michael's note. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed her face as she closed the front door behind her. In the driveway, her car waited, packed with the essentials for her new life. Tomorrow morning, she would board a flight to Arizona, leaving behind the cold Connecticut spring for the warm embrace of the desert and her sister's welcoming guest house. As Deborah pulled away from the curb, she glanced in her rearview mirror at the house growing smaller in the distance. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt not grief or resignation, but something unexpected: hope. Tonight, Michael would return to an empty house, unaware that it was no longer his home. Tomorrow the new owners would arrive with their moving truck and their dreams, and Deborah Miller would be on her way to reclaiming the dignity and respect that had been hers all along. Michael Miller returned home at 6:37 p.m., whistling as he swung his car into the driveway. The day had been productive. He'd met with two friends who'd agreed to invest in his business venture, convinced more by his enthusiasm than by any concrete business plan. They'd sealed the deal over beers at O'Malley's, where Michael had spent a bit more than he should have, but it felt justified. Things were finally looking up. He noticed his mother's car was missing from its usual spot by the curb, probably at one of her book club meetings, he thought. Good. He wasn't in the mood for her quiet disapproval tonight, not when he finally had something to celebrate. The house was silent as he entered, flicking on lights as he moved through the rooms. No smell of dinner cooking, no soft sound of the television from the living room. Michael checked his watch. Strange. His mother was typically home by now, often with a meal prepared. He'd grown accustomed to that particular convenience since moving back in. "Mom?" he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the empty house. No response. Michael shrugged and headed to the kitchen, opening the refrigerator to find it unusually bare. Just condiments, a half-empty carton of milk, and some leftover pizza from earlier in the week. Nothing prepared for dinner. Irritation flickered briefly. He'd expected to come home to one of her home-cooked meals. His eyes fell on the note he'd left that morning, still on the counter. But now, beside it, lay a single house key. Michael picked it up, turning it over in his hand with confusion. Why would his mother leave her key behind? Was she making some kind of point about having to enter through the garage now? Michael grabbed a beer from the refrigerator and wandered into the living room, flipping on the television. He'd wait for her to get home and then suggest ordering takeout, maybe Chinese. He was in the mood to celebrate his new investors after all. As the evening wore on, Michael's mild curiosity about his mother's absence deepened into unease. By 9 p.m., he tried calling her cell phone, only to have it go straight to voicemail. He sent a text, "Where are you? Dinner." By 10 p.m., with no response, Michael began to pace. It wasn't like Deborah to stay out late without mentioning it. Had something happened? Should he be worried? He checked the garage. Her overnight bag was gone, and the space looked tidier than usual, emptier somehow. A nagging feeling prompted him to check the rest of the house more carefully. In the home office, nothing seemed amiss until his gaze landed on an envelope atop the filing cabinet, his name written in his mother's precise handwriting. Michael tore it open, his eyes scanning the contents with increasing disbelief. "The house will have been legally sold. Utilities remain in your name. What it feels like to have your security and dignity stripped away. Please do not attempt to contact me." He read it 3 times, his hands beginning to shake. This had to be a joke, a bizarre attempt to teach him some kind of lesson. His mother couldn't just sell the house, could she? But the copy of the sale documents attached to the letter suggested otherwise. Dated today, they clearly showed the transfer of ownership from Deborah Miller to a couple named Brandon and Erica Simmons. "This is insane," Michael muttered, running a hand through his hair. "She can't do this." But even as the words left his mouth, realization dawned. Of course she could. The house had been left entirely to her after his father died. Michael had never been added to the deed, despite his occasional hints that it would make things simpler if he were a co-owner. His mind raced. Tomorrow. The new owners would be here tomorrow. Where was he supposed to go? What about his business inventory? His things? In a panic, Michael rushed to his bedroom, relieved to find it untouched. Clothes still spilling from drawers, electronics scattered across his desk, gaming system connected to the small TV in the corner. At least she hadn't disposed of his belongings. His eyes caught on a small wrapped package on his bed. He tore it open to find the old photo of him and his father fishing, now carefully framed. The sight of his father's face, smiling, proud, with his arm around a 10-year-old Michael, sent a wave of complicated emotions crashing over him. Shame, anger, confusion, and beneath it all, a dawning horror at what he had done and what was now happening to him. "She's bluffing," he said aloud, setting the frame down with more care than he'd shown anything in months. "She wouldn't really leave me homeless. This is just to scare me." But the more he thought about it, the more the pieces fell into place. His mother's quiet acquiescence to moving into the garage, her uncharacteristic absences over the past 2 weeks, the boxes she'd never unpacked, the lack of complaint when he'd suggested the basement apartment. Michael rushed back to the kitchen, scanning the counters and table for any other notes or clues. Finding nothing, he yanked open drawers, looking for, he wasn't sure what, some indication that this wasn't really happening. In the 3rd drawer, beneath a stack of dish towels, he found a business card. Patricia Winters, realtor. His mother's friend, Pat, of course. Despite the late hour, Michael dialed the number on the card. It went to voicemail. He left a rambling message demanding information about the sale, insisting there must be some mistake. Next, he tried his mother again. Straight to voicemail. Then his Aunt Jean in Arizona. No answer there either. Frustrated, Michael slammed his fist against the counter, then winced at the pain. This couldn't be happening. Not now, when things were finally looking up with his business. The inventory, the investments he'd just secured. Panic rising, Michael ran upstairs to what had been his mother's bedroom, now filled with the shelving units and boxes of electronics he'd ordered, with the last of the money she'd loaned him. What was he supposed to do with all of this? Where could he possibly move it by tomorrow? He sank onto a box, his head in his hands. How had it come to this? Just hours ago, he'd been celebrating his imminent success, and now the sound of his phone ringing jolted him back to the present. He fumbled to answer it, hope surging that it might be his mother. "Hello? Mom? Michael? "It's Pat Winters." The realtor's voice was cool, professional. "I received your message. I understand you're upset, but I want to be clear. The sale of the house at 47 Maple Street is legal and binding. The new owners will be taking possession at noon tomorrow." "But you can't just—" "I live here," Michael sputtered. "My mother had no right to—" "She had every right," Pat interrupted firmly. As the sole owner of the property, Deborah was free to sell it at any time. The paperwork is complete, the funds have been transferred, and the new owners are excited to move in. I suggest you use the time you have left to make arrangements." "Arrangements? Where am I supposed to go? What about all my stuff, my business inventory?" And there was a pause on the line. Then Pat's voice softened slightly. "Michael, I've known you since you were a teenager. I was friends with both your parents. So I'm going to say this once, and I hope you hear it. What did you expect would happen when you moved your mother into the garage, like an old lawnmower?" The blunt question landed like a physical blow. Michael had no immediate response. "Your mother mentioned she left you funds to secure new housing," Pat continued after a moment. "I'd suggest using them wisely. As for your belongings, you have until noon tomorrow. The new owners are aware there may be some items to remove, but they won't be particularly patient. Good night, Michael." The line went dead, leaving Michael staring at his phone in disbelief. For the first time, the full reality of his situation hit him. His mother was gone. The house was sold. By this time tomorrow, he would have nowhere to live. The panic that had been building reached a crescendo. Michael rushed from room to room, as if searching for a solution hidden in some corner of the house. In the living room, he noticed for the first time that certain items were missing. The antique clock that had been his grandmother's, the landscape painting his parents had bought on their 20th anniversary trip to Maine, the collection of family photos that had always sat on the mantel. In the dining room, the china cabinet stood empty. The good dishes and silver passed down through his mother's family now gone. In the hallway, the hooks where his father's favorite fishing hat had hung since his death were bare. His mother had taken only what truly mattered to her, what held sentimental value. She'd left the furniture, the appliances, the structure, but removed the heart of the home. Michael returned to the kitchen and slumped at the table, his mother's letter still clutched in his hand. He read it again, this time letting the words sink in. "What it feels like to have your security and dignity stripped away without warning or discussion." Had that really been what he'd done to her? In his mind, he'd been making practical decisions about space utilization. The business needed room to grow. His mother didn't need that big bedroom just for herself. The garage was perfectly habitable. The basement could be converted. But stripped of his rationalizations, what had he actually done? Relegated his widowed mother to the garage, then proposed moving her to the basement with a camping toilet. All without discussion, without considering her feelings, without a shred of the respect she deserved. "Jesus," Michael whispered, shame washing over him. What would his father have said? The thought made him flinch. His phone buzzed with a text message. For a hopeful moment, he thought it might be his mother, but it was just one of his friends from earlier. "Thanks for the drinks, man. Excited about the business opportunity." The business opportunity. Michael laughed bitterly. What business? A few boxes of drop-shipped electronics he'd marked up, trying to make quick money without the commitment of actual work. Deep down, he knew it was just another in a string of get-rich-quick schemes he'd pursued since college, none of which had panned out. And now he'd driven away the one person who had always supported him, always believed he could do better, always provided a safety net when he failed. Michael stood abruptly, suddenly needing air. He stepped outside onto the front porch, the night air cool against his flushed face. The street was quiet, peaceful, the neighbors' homes warm with light and life. How many of those neighbors had watched him move his mother to the garage? What had they thought of him? For the first time in years, perhaps since his divorce, Michael allowed himself to see his actions through others' eyes, through his mother's eyes. The picture wasn't flattering. Back inside, determination replaced despair. He had until noon tomorrow. Not much time, but enough to salvage what he could. Michael spent the night in a frenzy of activity. He called friends, seeking temporary storage for his belongings and a couch to crash on. Most were surprised by his sudden need, and more than a few seemed hesitant to offer help, especially when he explained the circumstances. By 3 a.m., he'd secured a promise from his friend Dave to help move his things into Dave's garage. Just for a couple weeks, man, until you figure something out. He rented a small storage unit online for the business inventory, wincing at the cost. He packed his clothing and essential items into suitcases and boxes, making trip after trip down to his car, filling the trunk and back seat. As dawn broke, Michael stood in what had been his mother's bedroom, now stripped of the shelving units he'd installed just days ago. The walls were bare where her artwork had hung, the closet empty of her neatly organized clothing. He tried to remember what the room had looked like when it was hers. The quilted bedspread, the small writing desk by the window where she wrote letters, the shelf of novels she loved to read, all gone now, just like her. By 10 a.m., Dave arrived with his pickup truck, and they began loading the business inventory. Dave was uncharacteristically quiet as they worked, and Michael could feel judgment radiating from his friend. "So your mom just left?" Dave finally asked, as they carried a shelving unit down the stairs. "She sold the house and moved to Arizona," Michael replied, keeping his tone neutral, "to live near my aunt." "Without telling you?" Michael hesitated. "She left a letter." Dave raised an eyebrow but said nothing more as they continued loading the truck. At 11:45 a.m., as they were making the final trip to Dave's truck, a silver SUV pulled into the driveway. A young couple emerged, the woman visibly pregnant, the man tall with a friendly face. The new owners. "Hello?" the man called, approaching with his hand extended. "I'm Brandon Simmons. This is my wife, Erica." "You must be Michael." Michael shook the offered hand automatically, feeling oddly disconnected from the moment. "Yes, I'm just finishing up." "No rush," Brandon said, though his glance at his watch suggested otherwise. "The moving truck won't be here until 1. Is Mrs. Miller around? We'd love to thank her personally." The innocent question hit Michael like another blow. "No," he managed. She's moved already." "Oh," Erica said, one hand resting on her rounded belly. "That's too bad. The house is so lovely. She must have taken wonderful care of it." "She did," Michael agreed, his throat suddenly tight. "She really did." An awkward silence fell, broken only when Dave called from the truck. "That's the last of it, Mike." "I guess we'll get going then," Michael said, fishing in his pocket for his house key. He held it out to Brandon. "Here, it's all yours now." Brandon accepted the key with a smile. "Thanks. We're really excited. This is our first house, and with the baby coming." He trailed off, seeming to sense Michael's discomfort. "It's a good house," Michael said quietly. "A good place to raise a family." He walked to his car, now packed to the brim with his possessions, feeling the couple's eyes on his back. As he slid into the driver's seat, he caught a glimpse of them in his rearview mirror, standing together on the front porch, her head on his shoulder, both looking up at their new home with unmistakable joy, the same home where Michael had grown up, where his father had taught him to throw a baseball in the backyard, where his mother had nursed him through chicken pox and heartbreaks and job losses, where he had returned after his divorce, seeking comfort and finding it, only to throw it away through selfishness and entitlement. As he drove away from 47 Maple Street for the last time, following Dave's truck to a temporary refuge he didn't deserve, Michael finally allowed himself to cry, not for the loss of the house or the inconvenience of his current situation, but for the realization of who he had become and who he had hurt along the way. That night, curled uncomfortably on Dave's too small couch, Michael reread his mother's letter one more time. The words no longer sparked anger or disbelief, but a deep, aching regret. "I raised you to be better than the man you've become." In the quiet darkness of his friend's living room, surrounded by the scattered remnants of his life, Michael made a silent promise to his absent mother, to his deceased father, but mostly to himself. He would be better. He would earn back his mother's respect, his own self-respect. Somehow, someday, he would make this right. But for now, all he could do was face the consequences of his actions and begin the long, difficult process of rebuilding, not just a place to live, but the person he needed to become. 3 months passed, like a slow-motion collapse for Michael Miller. After 2 weeks on Dave's couch, 2 weeks of increasingly strained smiles and pointed comments about figuring out a plan, Michael had moved to a shabby studio apartment on the edge of Fairfield. The rent consumed nearly half of his income from the electronics store, where he had reluctantly increased his hours to full-time after his business venture imploded spectacularly. The investors had withdrawn their support when they learned he no longer had the house as a base of operations. The inventory languished in a storage unit he could barely afford, gathering dust instead of profits. Each month, the automatic payment for the unit carved another chunk from his dwindling bank account, a constant reminder of his hubris. On a sweltering August afternoon, Michael sat at the small folding table that served as both his dining area and desk, staring at his laptop. The fan in the window offered little relief from the heat, pushing around humid air that smelled faintly of the Chinese restaurant below. A stack of bills lay beside him. Electric, internet, cell phone, credit card statements with balances that grew despite his attempts to chip away at them. And at the bottom of the stack, a final notice from the storage facility. Pay the overdue balance by Friday, or the contents would be auctioned off. Michael rubbed his eyes, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. He hadn't had a full night's sleep since moving into this apartment, kept awake by the combination of financial anxiety and the persistent noise from the street below. How had it come to this? 3 months ago, he'd been living in a beautiful colonial home in one of Fairfield's best neighborhoods, convinced his business was about to take off, that his life was on the verge of turning around. Now he was one missed paycheck away from genuine financial disaster. But the worst part, the part that kept him awake at night, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, wasn't the cramped apartment or the mounting bills. It was the silence from his mother. Michael had tried calling her numerous times in those first chaotic weeks. Each call went straight to voicemail. Texts went unanswered. Emails bounced back. She had cut him off completely, just as she'd promised in her letter. He had even tried calling Aunt Jean, only to have her answer once, say tersely, "She's not ready to talk to you, Michael," and hang up. Subsequent calls to Jean went unanswered as well. The isolation was crushing. Michael had never realized how much he had relied on his mother's constant presence, her unwavering support, until it was gone. The friends he'd cultivated over the years, mostly drinking buddies and casual acquaintances, had proven fair weather at best. Dave had been the only one to offer concrete help, and even that relationship had soured under the strain of Michael's extended stay. With a sigh, Michael opened his laptop and navigated to his bank account. The balance mocked him, $347.13. Not enough to cover the storage unit payment and keep the electricity on. It was time to face reality. The business was a bust. The inventory needed to go. 2 days later, Michael stood in the storage facility, surrounded by boxes of electronics he'd purchased with such optimism. Bluetooth speakers, knockoff smartwatches, phone accessories, all purchased in bulk from overseas suppliers. All intended for resale at marked-up prices through online marketplaces. He'd convinced himself it was entrepreneurship. Now, in the harsh fluorescent light of the storage unit, it looked like what it was, a poorly conceived get-rich-quick scheme. He'd negotiated with the facility manager to give him the weekend to clear out the unit, rather than letting the contents go to auction. Now, armed with a stack of printed flyers advertising a business liquidation sale in the parking lot of the storage facility, Michael began unpacking boxes, arranging the items on folding tables he'd borrowed from work. The sale went better than he'd expected. By Sunday evening, he'd sold about 70% of the inventory, at a significant loss from what he'd paid, but enough to cover the overdue storage payment and put a small dent in his credit card debt. The remaining items he packed into his car, planning to sell them online individually or, failing that, give them away. As Michael folded up the tables at dusk, a strange sense of lightness came over him. The business was officially dead, but with it died the delusions he'd been harboring for months. Years, if he was honest. For the first time since his mother's departure, he felt something close to clarity. Driving back to his apartment, Michael made a decision. It was time to stop wallowing in self-pity and start rebuilding his life. Not the fantasy life of quick success and easy money he'd chased for so long, but a real life, grounded in reality and genuine effort. The following morning, Michael arrived at the electronics store 30 minutes early, something he hadn't done since taking the job years ago. Linda, the store manager, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had made no secret of her skepticism when Michael returned to full-time hours, raised an eyebrow as he approached her office. "Got a minute, Linda?" he asked, uncomfortably aware that this might be the first time he'd ever sought her out, rather than being summoned for a reprimand. "Clock's ticking," she replied, gesturing to the chair across from her desk without looking up from her paperwork. Michael sat, gathering his thoughts. "I wanted to talk about my position here." Now Linda did look up, her expression wary. "If you're quitting, company policy requires 2 weeks' notice." "I'm not quitting," Michael said quickly. "Actually, I was wondering if there might be advancement opportunities. I know I haven't been the most reliable employee in the past, but I'm committed now. I need this job, and I want to do well at it." Linda studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "Why the sudden change of heart, Miller? Last I checked, you were building an empire and just working here to pay the bills until the real money starts rolling in." Her air quotes made him wince, remembering his own boastful words from months ago. "Things change," Michael said quietly. "I've changed. Or I'm trying to anyway." Linda's skepticism was palpable. "Heard you had some family troubles. Your mom moved away suddenly?" The small-town grapevine never ceased to amaze Michael. "Something like that," he acknowledged. Linda tapped her pen against the desk. "Well, as it happens, we do have an assistant manager position opening up next month. James is moving to Boston. The job requires reliability, attention to detail, and actual customer service skills, not just showing up when you feel like it and doing the minimum." "I understand," Michael said, sitting straighter. "I can do that. I will do that. It also requires completion of the company's management training program, 6 weeks of online coursework, on your own time." She fixed him with a pointed look. "No shortcuts." "I'll start tonight," Michael promised, feeling a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Genuine motivation. Linda nodded slowly. "I'll put you on the list of candidates. But Michael," her voice sharpened, "this is your last chance here. I'm going out on a limb even considering you, given your track record. Don't make me regret it." "You won't," Michael said, with more confidence than he felt. "Thank you, Linda." That evening, instead of collapsing on his second-hand couch to mindlessly scroll through social media, Michael sat at his folding table with his laptop open to the company's training portal. The first module was titled Fundamentals of Retail Management. Not exactly thrilling content, but Michael approached it with a determination that surprised him. As the weeks passed, a new routine emerged. Work, training modules, sleep, repeat. He picked up extra shifts whenever possible, building a small cushion in his bank account. He completed the management coursework ahead of schedule, earning a raised eyebrow and what might have been approval from Linda. Most importantly, he began the painful process of honest self-reflection. In quiet moments, washing dishes, walking to work, lying awake at night, Michael forced himself to examine the patterns that had defined his adult life. The sense of entitlement, the expectation that success and comfort should come easily, the tendency to look for shortcuts rather than putting in sustained effort, the casual disregard for others' feelings when they conflicted with his desires. The image that emerged wasn't flattering, but acknowledging it was the first step toward change. One evening in late September, As autumn painted the trees in golds and crimsons, Michael sat at his folding table with a notebook open before him. At the top of the page, he'd written, "Letter to Mom," and then stared at the blank space below for nearly an hour. What could he possibly say? "Sorry I treated you like an inconvenience. Sorry I moved you to the garage and then suggested a camping toilet in the basement." The words seemed inadequate, almost insulting in their simplicity. And yet, he had to try. Not because he expected forgiveness or reconciliation. He wasn't sure he deserved either, but because acknowledging his wrongs was part of becoming the person he needed to be. "Dear Mum, I've started this letter a dozen times, and each attempt feels hollow. No words seem adequate to address what I did to you, or to express how deeply I regret my actions. You were right in your letter. I had become someone neither you nor Dad would recognize, someone selfish, entitled, and disrespectful. Moving you to the garage wasn't a practical solution to a space problem. It was a callous dismissal of your dignity and your rightful place in your own home. Suggesting the basement with a camping toilet wasn't problem-solving, it was dehumanizing. I could offer excuses, my divorce, financial pressure, a misguided desire for success, but they would only demonstrate that I'm still missing the point. The truth is simpler and harder to admit. I was thinking only of myself, treating you as an obstacle rather than as my mother, a human being deserving of respect and consideration. These past months have been a wake-up call. Losing the house, struggling financially, facing the consequences of my actions, all of it has forced me to look at myself honestly for perhaps the first time in my adult life. What I've seen isn't pretty, but recognizing the problem is the first step toward fixing it. I'm trying to change, Mom. Really change, not just make empty promises. I've committed to my job, pursuing advancement opportunities rather than chasing get-rich-quick schemes. I'm learning to live within my means and take responsibility for my choices. Most importantly, I'm working on becoming someone who considers others' needs and feelings, not just my own. I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not even asking for that yet. But I wanted you to know that the lesson you taught me, painful as it was, has taken root. You raised me to be better than the man I became, and I'm finally trying to live up to that. I miss you. I miss your wisdom, your quiet strength, your unwavering support, even when I didn't deserve it. If you ever feel ready to speak with me again, I would be grateful for the chance. But I understand if that day never comes. With love and profound regret, Michael. He read over the letter twice, fighting the urge to crumple it up and start again. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Perhaps the first truly honest communication he'd had with his mother in years. Michael addressed an envelope to Aunt Jean's house in Sedona, the only address he had for his mother now. He wasn't sure she would even read the letter, but sending it felt like a necessary step in his own journey, regardless of the outcome. The following week brought unexpected news at work. Linda called Michael into her office and offered him the assistant manager position, with a modest but welcome salary increase. The validation of his efforts provided a much-needed boost to his confidence, reinforcing his commitment to his new path. With the additional income, Michael began looking for a slightly better apartment, not because he was unhappy with his current situation, but because the constant noise and pervasive smell of Chinese food were wearing on him. He found a one-bedroom in a quieter neighborhood, still modest, but with actual furniture included, and a small balcony overlooking a community garden. The day he signed the lease, Michael felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with quick success or impressing others. This apartment wasn't a gift or a default. It was something he had earned through consistent effort and responsible choices. As October arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and early darkness, Michael established another new routine. Each Sunday evening, he wrote a letter to his mother. Some were updates on his life, the new apartment, the promotion, small daily victories and challenges. Others were deeper reflections on his ongoing efforts to change, memories of childhood lessons he had forgotten or ignored, apologies for specific instances of thoughtlessness or disrespect over the years. He sent each letter to Aunt Jean's address, never knowing if they were read or immediately discarded. No response came, but Michael continued writing anyway. The letters became a form of therapy, a way to process his thoughts and hold himself accountable. In late October, nearly 5 months after his mother's departure, Michael found himself driving past 47 Maple Street, his old home. He hadn't intended to go there. It was well out of his way, but some subconscious navigation had brought him to the familiar street, and he slowed as the house came into view. The new owners had painted the shutters a deep green instead of the traditional black his mother had preferred. A colourful wreath hung on the front door, and planters full of chrysanthemums lined the front walk. A basketball hoop had been installed in the driveway. The young couple was preparing for the family they were building. Michael felt a pang of nostalgia, but not the bitterness he had expected. The house looked loved, cared for. It was no longer his home, had never truly been his home if he was honest, but seeing it well maintained brought a peculiar comfort. As he drove away, Michael realized something had shifted within him. The anger and self-pity that had dominated his emotions in the immediate aftermath of his mother's departure had evolved into something more complex. A genuine understanding of what he had done and a sincere desire to make amends. Not just to repair his relationship with his mother, but to become someone worthy of her respect and his own. That evening in his new apartment, modest but tidy, with a small potted plant on the balcony, his first attempt at nurturing something other than his own ego, Michael sat down to write his weekly letter. "Dear Mom, I drove past the house today. The new owners have painted the shutters green and put up a basketball hoop. It looks different, but good different, like it's starting a new chapter too. I realize now that what you did wasn't about punishing me, though I certainly deserved consequences. It was about teaching me something I desperately needed to learn, something Dad tried to teach me before he passed, that respect isn't optional in relationships that matter, and that actions have real consequences. I'm not there yet, Mom. I still catch myself falling into old patterns, expecting things to be easy, looking for shortcuts, thinking of my needs first. But I'm aware now in a way I wasn't before, and that awareness is the beginning of change. Thank you for the hardest lesson I've ever learned. I hope someday I can thank you in person and show you that it wasn't wasted. Love, Michael." He sealed the envelope, added it to his outgoing mail, and stepped out onto his small balcony. The community garden below was quiet in the evening light, the raised beds prepared for winter, waiting for spring's renewal. Michael took a deep breath of the cool autumn air, feeling for the first time in a very long time a sense of peace with his place in the world. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. Real change never was. But for the first time since that fateful day when he'd suggested his mother move to the garage, Michael Miller was facing reality with clear eyes and a genuine commitment to becoming someone better, someone his mother and his father could be proud of. Whether forgiveness would come remained to be seen. But in the meantime, Michael had found something unexpected in the wreckage of his former life, the beginnings of self-respect, built not on delusions of easy success, but on the solid foundation of honest effort and genuine growth. On a crisp December morning, Michael checked his mailbox as he did each day before heading to work. Among the usual bills and advertisements was an envelope with an Arizona postmark. His heart stuttered at the sight of his mother's neat handwriting, the first response to his letters in nearly 7 months. With trembling fingers, he opened it, leaning against the wall of his apartment building as he read, "Dear Michael, I've received your letters, all of them. At first I wasn't ready to read them, but Jean encouraged me to try. I'm glad I did. Life in Sedona has been good for me. The guest house is lovely, and I've made friends through Jean's community. I'm even teaching an art class at the senior center, something I'd always wanted to try but never found time for. Your father would be proud of the changes you're making." Not because they're grand or perfect, but because they're genuine. Real growth happens in small moments of choice, in daily habits that slowly reshape who we are. You seem to understand that now. I won't pretend the hurt is completely healed. What happened between us left deep marks, but I see your effort, Michael, and it matters. I'll be visiting Connecticut for 3 days next month. Martha from my book club is having surgery, and I promise to help. If you'd like to meet for coffee, I'd be open to that. No pressure, just an opportunity if you're interested. Your mother, Deborah Michael, read the letter 3 times, tears blurring his vision. Not a sweeping forgiveness, but something better, a small, genuine opening. 2 weeks later, they sat across from each other at a quiet cafe, halfway between Fairfield and Hartford. The conversation was awkward at first, weighted with months of silence and years of accumulated hurts. But gradually, as they shared updates on their lives, her art classes, his promotion, her new friends, his modest apartment with the balcony garden, the familiar rhythm of mother and son began to re-emerge. "I'm sorry, Mom," Michael said finally. The words he'd written so many times now, spoken aloud, for everything. Deborah reached across the table and took his hand, the first physical contact between them since that day in May. "I know," she said simply. "That's why I'm here." As they parted that afternoon, plans tentatively made for her next visit in spring, Michael realized that what his mother had given him wasn't just a second chance at their relationship. It was a blueprint for how to live, with dignity, with accountability, and with the courage to rebuild what seemed irreparably broken. The road ahead would have its challenges. Trust, once shattered, doesn't mend overnight. But as Michael watched his mother's car pull away, he felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. The quiet pride of becoming someone worthy of her respect, and more importantly, his own. Some lessons come at a tremendous cost. The truly valuable ones change us forever.